In the 1960s and 70s, the city of Chicago was a diverse community of political and social expansion. But while Chicago was an urban space of culture and a close community, there was more than this that meets the eye. Chicago in the 1960s was clearly not the most structured, as the political and social unrest in the time period presented conflict within the city and throughout America. With the tension that presented itself in Chicago during the 1960s, the motivations of artists living in Chicago gave way to many new movements in the city. Thus, the creation of the Chicago Imagists movement, starting in 1966 when a small group of artists who were graduates of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago formed Harry Who, a series of exhibitions at the Hyde Park Art Center curated by Don Baum. The 6 members of Harry Who were just some of the many artists in Chicago who would later be known as Imagists, not just in their city but nationwide. The Chicago Imagists group, with their passion for creating art as well as presenting their work on a larger scale, had a large impact on the art world in America. These groups laid the foundation for political and social discussions in Chicago in the 1960s and 70s with provocative and diverse art. While it may seem as though the Imagists participated in a movement with little impact as opposed to movements such as pop art, the Imagist groups brought extensive attention to the Chicago art world. This can be seen as the press became infatuated with the image of groups such as Harry Who. The Imagists commented on events such as civil rights, feminism, and the Vietnam War through original, innovative, and personal art pieces. These groups inspired many other artist movements throughout the country and sparked attention in places such as New York. These artists left a deep imprint in art history and continue to be relevant today. The heart of the Imagist movement laid in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, also known as SAIC. As many artists graduated from the school, the hope to present their artwork on a larger scale inspired the upcoming artists in Chicago to bring themselves forward. In mid-60s Chicago, however, artists did not have many galleries to present their work in. Soon, these upcoming artists found a new home to showcase their work, the Hyde Park Art Center, when Don Baum became the director in 1956. Baum, who had various connections in the art world, aimed to give artists in Chicago a space to get their work noticed. Here, he brought together a small group of artists: Jim Nutt, Art Green, Swellen Roca, James Falconer, Gladys Nilsson, and Carl Worsom, who later became the Harry Who. On February 25, 1966, the first Harry Who exhibition was held at the Hyde Park Art Center. The first exhibition sparked widespread attention and led to the creation of various other artist groups such as the Non-Plus-Sum and the False Imagists, which consisted of artists such as Roger Brown, Ed Flood, Barbara Rossi, and many other Chicago artists who graduated from the School of the Art Institute and aimed to present their work on a larger scale. These Imagist groups continued to make themselves a larger presence in Chicago. The Chicago Imagists were a diverse group of artists who differentiated themselves from previous art movements in Chicago and throughout the world. The origins of the Chicago Imagist movement were brought up at the beginning of the 20th century when the International Exhibition of Modern Art made its way to the Chicago art scene in 1913, sparking new artist movements inspired by those of New York's. Modeled by the artist movements presented in New York City, Chicago in the 1940s became a developing art community. Surrealism and Dada artist movements from the 1920s, as well as pop art movements beginning in the 1950s, closely shaped Chicagoans' art community to broaden the spectrum of unique and new art. These movements presented the base for the new Chicago artwork to expand in the 1960s, creating the movement of Imagism. The previous art movements allowed Imagists to differentiate their artwork and create pieces that may have been modeled by previous eras of pop art and Dada, but brought in a personal aspect of the Chicago community that many movements failed to demonstrate. The Imagist works reflected their personal environments.
Chicago, one of the things that makes Chicago curious is that it's one of those places where almost all of the important visual artists in Chicago are also faculty members here. That's not true in New York or LA or other places. So they ended up teaching the next generation of Chicago artists, some of whom continue the basic tradition of Chicago Imagism.
This refutes the claim that Imagism in Chicago was a loose confederation that seemed to mirror pop art from the decade before. It also shows that the environment in the bustling city of Chicago made Imagists a relevant presence who had the capability to create a large impact in the city. Another reason why their personal environment gave them a different style than previous movements was also due to a change in politics throughout the world and the changing social structure in America. Chicago, as well as the rest of the world in the 1960s and 1970s, placed itself in a political crisis. A major event that influenced Chicago images was the Democratic National Convention riots. In 1968, during the time of the Vietnam War, protesters in Chicago rioted against the police, rejecting intervention in Vietnam as delegates conversed on who would represent the Democratic Party. What started as a peaceful protest outside the convention led to a stockade between citizens and policemen. In the span of 4 days, the civil unrest provided a window for Imagists to reflect on the political issues presented in their current time. Imagists displayed their artwork in an unstable political environment, raising different interpretations of issues from the 60s and 70s. This shows their significance in the Chicago community as they branched out from the art world and made an imprint in the political aspects of society. These political debates soon shifted to social issues, as the unrest of the people became more and more heard. Not only did the work of the Chicago Imagists impact the politics of the 1960s and 70s, but it also accounted for the social scene. While Chicago was a flourishing urban space, the neighborhoods were separated racially as the civil rights movement was well in act. Civil rights played a large role in the Chicago community as it became an influential event, as in the Imagist artwork in the 1960s and 70s. After World War II, race riots in Chicago posed a great threat to the social status of minorities in Chicago. These riots led to police brutality as well as a social divide in the Chicago community, not only between whites and blacks, but many other groups such as Puerto Ricans. Race riots reached extreme levels, especially on the west side of town, due to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, which impacted the opening of the third and final Harry Hoot exhibition. Not only did race impact the images, but the ideas of feminism in the 1960s also played a role in the Imagist artwork. With the remaining social hierarchy between women and men in America, the Imagists did not distinguish between men and women as artists, promoting a sense of equality, contrary to the social standards presented during the 1960s. The civil rights movement, as well as the processes of feminism and equal rights, gave the Imagist movement a sense of personal conflict needed to create art for the public in order to establish social change in Chicago during this controversial time period. The Chicago Imagist movement had a large impact in the 1960s with its unique distinctions, political presence, and social interference. Today, Imagism has left a large impact on the Chicago community as well as American history.
They have undoubtedly been a movement in the history of art in Chicago, and to some degrees as national artists as well. They've gone on to long and significant careers, success in the marketplace, retrospectives of their individual works, books written about them. So there's no question that it has stood out as a very, very important visual art movement in Chicago. Probably the single most important one in the history of art in Chicago would be Imagism and the things that are around it. And it still continues to this day.
The Chicago Imagist movement did not just change the art world, but it found its way into the social and political aspects of society. With the Hyde Park Art Center remaining as a strong outlet for artists for 75 years, as well as SAIC being one of the top art schools in America. The Imagists leave behind decades of art that can only be understood by the world constructed in the 60s and 70s.